Our answer as leaders that time was hit several points. One is that our members demanded involvement, and I mean you can say let's not do it because it's a splitter, and it's not on the proper agenda for collective bargaining. You can't bargain with your school district at the end of the war, so why should be involved in it? But our members decided it was such a powerful overriding issue in our society that every meeting you'd go to, it would be raised by somebody. So you'd either spend all your time trying to talk people into not raising it or else deal with it. Number two is that some of us have, we had at least a broader vision for the union movement than was suggested by not being involved. The socialist agenda, which was the Social Democrat agenda, which was very strong in the AFT in the East, at the higher leadership intellectual levels, had as one of its premises this was an entree to power in American government. We could find a weak union, become dominant within that union, become dominant within the AFL-CIO, become dominant within the Democratic Party, and become dominant within the influence of the government through that mechanism, that series of mechanisms. And for someone to come along who I knew bought into that strategy and tell me that we shouldn't be involved in dealing with the issue to be or not to be in the Vietnam War, simply told me that they were disagreed with my position, not my strategy. And that they're involved in the same strategy, but they just want a different outcome to the process. And we didn't resent that because that was fair enough. We could go to open conventions and debate the issues. And if we could persuade 50% plus one to vote for us, then our policy would become the end result of that strategy that we believed in. And we thought that's what was hurting the trade union in general, was that they had lost their way and didn't recognize that the very quality of life in our society was something that they had a responsibility to create and mold for their membership, as well as negotiating a contract at the bargaining table. One of the perspectives that emerged from the debate in the AFT over the issue of involvement or non-involvement of the United States in Southeast Asia was that many of us who in California who would really fancy ourselves as pragmatic ACLU Democrats with we'd say, you know, on Saturday night and behind the right stuff, we'd claim that we were socialists. There was no structural frame of reference in California of any significant nature, above all in the labor movement or even outside the labor movement, for that political ideology to take hold or to gain recruits. When we got involved in the AFT at the national level politics, some of us were approached by AFT leadership in the East. I remember the Sandy Feldman on a weekend in New York City along the spring of 1970, 71, somewhere along there, making a conscious effort to have me join the Socialist Party USA at that time, before it split over the war into the Democratic Socialists and eventually DSOC, the Democratic Socialists of America. And on that single issue, that difference on the involvement or non-involvement in the Vietnam War, not on civil rights, albeit the issue of affirmative action was starting to emerge as another splitter issue due to the third major strike in New York City over the Ocean Hill-Brownsville decentralization issue. But I didn't join. I refused to join at that time because of the hostile position of the that faction of the Socialist Party to the anti-war movement. And from that emerged through both reading and personal contact and talking to people in the AFT, Dave Zeldin being primary amongst them, it began to a pattern and an outline of the Democratic Socialist strategy and its strong role in the AFT through when Yetta Shachtman, Al Shanker's secretary, finally in my mind formed a linkage with Socialist Shachtman and the Shachtmanite strategy, which I was familiar with and supported and believe in now, and think the AFT is playing a very strong role in that direction of influencing public policy in the direction of our federal government and hopefully eventually state and local governments to a more progressive, enlightened society, representational government, emerged as the real force in the AFT. And you began to look at people almost first that they in the AFT, not they were in the Progressive Caucus or not in the Progressive Caucus, but whether they were SD or not SD in terms of their political orientation, because that little bumper sticker became code word for a whole set of strategies. And I believe that it's a proper role for a union to play to go beyond the bargaining table. And above all, the new era collective bargaining is emerging upon us as being sometimes a lose-lose process, that you have to deal with laws in Congress to achieve ends that you used to do at the bargaining table. A classic example of this new need to redefine ourselves as a union into a coalition, part of and hopefully a leader of a coalition political strategy, was the incredible havoc that one man with one idea at the right time for the wrong purpose, named Proposition 13, which plowed under in one legislative populist vote of the people of California, collective bargaining. For all intents and purposes, collective bargaining is an economic vehicle. It doesn't exist because it shifted all the funding, all the revenue making from 80% of it from the local level to the state. And so when the state, you have to go to the state now and get a revenue bill, and if they give you 6% at the state, that's what you're going to get at the local level. You don't bargain for anything. It changed the entire nature of collective bargaining in California. So that's an example of the kind of issue that transcends collective bargaining, which you cannot organize a union by itself to bargain away. You have to organize a coalition, work with other allied organizations of people, and put together a political operation to represent your members, just as you did at the local level in collective bargaining. As a result of this, we found ourselves spending much more of our time organizing other organizations to work with us. For example, we formed something called the coalition called the Citizens for Education, which incorporates all the employee organizations in the public sector: AFSCME, SEIU, the AFT, California School Employees Association, California State Employees Association, the PTA, League of Women Voters, ACLU, various political organizations, Republican and Democrat, into a coalition that organized around the simple issue of adequate funding for public schools. So this was a result of Proposition 13. We saw how Jarvis did it, and we recognized that we'd have to broaden our base. You can't do it alone. And the AFL-CIO has played a leading role in the organization of this coalition. And it's been, we think, a weakness of the AFL-CIO historically is that George Meany always had great disdain for association with any outside organization. He thought that if the union didn't dominate and control, he didn't want to be party to it. And in the modern political world, we're going to have to find allies to help us get enough people elected from various districts to put across legislation for adequate revenue for public schools. The union movement has not totally embraced this idea, And they've been somewhat hesitant to break out of the meaning mold, but since Lane Kirkland's become president of AFL-CIO, we've gotten much more support from Central Labor Council and AFL-CIO staff people than we had in the past. One of the problems that this develops is that it detracts from the reason for people to remain part of the union at the local level. I mean, if you're going to do it with my vote through a coalition to get the state legislature to give us 6% more money, which is going to go right into my pocket, the 6% level, why am I paying dues at the local level? Second problem, ironic side effect, is that because we were so successful at the ACLU for teachers, and we have such strong laws protecting individual rights, they don't need the union to protect their job security any longer. Their contract isn't the security of their jobs. The state law and court precedent, lawsuits that we want, are really the foundation of their job security. So we're having to, if we look around for reasons for people to be involved, we find that to be involved in social issues in society affecting the broader community is a reason to be in the union. And I think the AFL-CIO has come around to that same circumstance now. One of the ironies, both historical and projecting to the future, is that within these coalitions, we find ourselves sitting at the same table on every single occasion with NEA, CTA, whatever the association might be. And we find ourselves locked in arms philosophically and in terms of issues with our union brothers in the association on almost every circumstance. The issue of merger is again active here in California. I say again without having raised it, but just to give it a frame of reference, that we are currently involved in talks with the California Teacher Association right now as representatives of the state AFT, because of the fact that we find ourselves as contrasted with ourselves in 1965, in 1985-86, we find ourselves both believing in collective bargaining, believing in the right to strike, running strikes, believing in binding arbitration, contracts, grievances, political action, coalition politics. The NEA used to be extremely to the extreme right and the AFT to the extreme left. Now we've crisscrossed where it's hard to, it depends on where you are in the country before you can say that. In other words, each organization has a left to right spectrum. We're caught up in the same Proposition 13 phenomena of revenue control at the state or national level. And we both believe in coalition politics. And our members are beginning to demand it again, as they did in 1969, 1970, that we get together. At that time, due in no small part, if not in total, to the vision of Dave Zeldin, who was president of the AFT at that time. Dave is a crackerjack organizer and had the natural vision of the future of Republican employees. Maybe he wasn't the best union administrator that ever lived, or union politician, but he certainly recognized where we were going from beginning in the 1940s to this day. And at that time, he began to argue that in very short order, the NEA was going to change its position and come out for collective bargaining. And if we weren't prepared to take advantage of that opportunity, they would overwhelm us with their numbers. And if they didn't overwhelm us with their numbers, they'd eventually do it by attrition. Because if they bought into collective bargaining and went for contracts, the history of the trade union movement tells us that once the pie is cut up, jurisdictional changes come along with the regularity of Hawley's comment. They just don't happen. And then once the pie got cut up and we got the small piece of it, eventually attrition would do us into the movement, and we would lose our progressive direction that we thought we could bring to the union movement. And the NEA would become the AFL-CIO Teachers Union, and the AFT would be out of business. So he argued that we had to be prepared to do something very difficult, and that was go to the faithful, back to the analogy of the church, and tell them that the pill was in, that abortions were good, that divorce was acceptable, but you can still be a Catholic. And it was, and when you take risks like that, you can't turn light switches and change membership allegiance. They resent it. So it's a high risk activity, and when you represent people to change dramatically on any issue, after you spent so much time convincing them that they were right and where they've been taken. So they began talking as early as 66, 67 in my contact with him about a vision of the United Teachers of America, democratically affiliated with the trade union movement, of which the AFT would be a strong left-center driving force within this new teacher organization. And at first it was resisted by many people. They were opposed to it. You don't go to bed with the devil. And albeit the rationale behind it was overwhelming every time you raised the question or pointed out the reality that everybody in the AFT, for the most part, was in the NEA first. If they affiliate with labor, that's our goal. And the history of the labor movement is full of amalgamations, consolidations, mergers, co-options, and such organizing activities. And that if we really wanted power, we needed numbers. The reality and the logic of that line of reasoning began to take hold. And AFT councils, both here in California and nationally, it began to become a majority position of at least the leadership role that people I was in contact with. Here in California, we had a unique opportunity for the merger concept. The city of Los Angeles, one of the only major city in America that I can think of, major city in America that was not an AFT city, at that time had 19,000 CTA NEA members and about 2,200 AFT members. And our AFT local in Los Angeles couldn't get started for the same reasons I've been describing. The members were tied into insurance policies. They were, as early as 1968, it's called the Association of Classroom Teachers in Los Angeles, had broken with the CTA and came out for collective bargaining, demanding contracts, talking about strikes. And it was taking doing unto us as what the Democratic Party did to the populists in the 1890s. They just took our platform overnight and it was gone. And we were left with 2,200 ideologues, and they had 19,000 people who were in the union but didn't understand what it meant. And they had arrived at a point where they wanted to go on strike and to get a contract. They had been their executive director was a guy named Don Baer, who had cut his teeth in NEA in Milwaukee, and was really a unionist in terms of his strategy. He believed he understood the process, and he thought that even though we had a law in California that said you could not have a contract, that if a teacher union of 30,000 people went on strike, and shut the place down, that they'd have to give him a contract. The second thing he decided was that he couldn't do it without the AFT membership, that his own association members would fall by the wayside when the crunch came on the strike, and that he needed the AFT members who were militant to be the picket captains, the strike leaders, and the core of the strike. And that without us, he couldn't succeed. And we added to that perception, albeit at the time we didn't know this is all hindsight through revelation. They called a one-day walkout just for the exercise, to get their people to do it one time just to get the feel of it. And with our urging from the state CFT, we persuaded the 1021 Executive Board and our president, Larry Silverman, to declare a general strike. Not a general strike, but an open-ended strike. To go on strike for 2 days. In other words, they were going to walk out on Thursday, and we said, let's stay till Monday and see who we can drag along with this, and we will, in a classic radical political strategy, escalate the demands, compel a response that they didn't want to give, and take advantage of the results by organizing the people who would be angry about it, who feel that the association, by going out one day and going back in, sold them out. If they stayed the second day, we could recruit those people. Two realities came out of it. One, we were wrong. The people who stayed the second day weren't mad at them, they were mad at us for not being able to sustain our claim to go to the third day on Monday. And two, the NEA became absolutely convinced that the only way they could succeed is with us, because we could play a spoiler role if nothing else. So you had two organizations groping around in the dark with short-term and long-term strategies that crisscrossed at various points without having any awareness of where these points were going to be. A year later, the association leadership contacted the local leadership here in Los Angeles and proposed secret talks to merge into United Teachers Los Angeles. Dave Zeldin was active at the national level this time, forming committees for contacts with the NEA. There had been one merger, I believe, in Flint, Michigan, in which our local disappeared overnight. It was an assimilation. There were talks in Florida and in New Orleans. There are articles being written all over the country about the issue of merger. It was time every educational leader was asked, are you yes or favorite or opposed to it? And so we were actively campaigning on the issue here in California. We'd go into schools and we proposed a merger at the local level between many of our affiliates and the association. They continually said no, and the teachers would be upset because they thought it was a wonderful idea. You go to Pasadena or Poway or Alhambra or Burlingame or Sacramento and you walk up and grab three teachers out of the faculty lounge and say, do you think the NEA and AFT should merge? 99% of them would say yes. And if you say with AFL-CIO affiliation, you'd lose half of them at that time. But at least that was an enormous leap forward that half of them would stay in the AFL-CIO even if it was part of the merger. And if you said democratic choice for affiliation with AFL-CIO, it'd jump up to 75 or 80%. And hell, what Zeldin claimed would happen was right before us. He said, let's merge and worry about the affiliation question later, which made consummate sense to us. However, the hardliners in the AFT, and Shanker was, although Dave has told me he originally, he being Shanker, believed in the affiliation option as a strategy, changed his mind and demanded mandatory affiliation to the AFL-CIO when he decided to throw Dave out as president. And he took a much harder line on that question, because the merger strategy created a real problem for Shanker. If he wanted to be president of the AFT, and they merged before he got to that role, he'd be pinned against the Atlantic Ocean on Manhattan Island as the president of one of the largest school districts in America. But he'd just be, they have 70,000 votes in an organization of 2 million is one circumstance. That 70,000 vote in an organization of 250,000, which is what we had that time, was a different political circumstance for him. And he also wanted to know he had to get to the AFL-CIO Executive Council quickly, because if he didn't, the NEA was going to be sitting there. Because if they merged, they would select that member to go to that council. So all this was occurring concurrently in the country at the same time when they came to us in Los Angeles, and we met in a restaurant called the Dresden Restaurant in North Vermont, Los Angeles, and they made their proposal. Credibility tests were applied to see if they were really playing serious. They were. Dave Zeldin was called, and the counterpart from the CTA, I was president of the state organization of the AFT, and the president of the CTA was involved, and the president of the NEA, and Dave Zeldin was involved, and we all signed off on what became the United Teachers of Los Angeles, which was really a coalition organization. It wasn't truly a merger, because there's still a local 1021 AFT, and there's still a CTA chapter, and they have combined into an umbrella organization called the United Teachers of Los Angeles. And it was the thrust of it from the association side was not a religious belief in merger. It was a mechanism to incorporate the AFT militancy into their strike action to get this first contract. And so the first thing that UTI did, besides create itself, with 22,000 members, was to go on strike almost immediately. And only 13,000 teachers went on strike. About 50% of the teaching staff of Los Angeles went out. Half stayed in, half went out. The strike should have ended in the first week, but on Wednesday night of the third day of the strike, the president of the association, and of UTLA now, really a decent man named Bob Ransom, the school counselor, became concerned because there had been a fight at one of the high schools, Jordan High School, and one student hit another one with a tire iron, put him in the hospital, which in reality was an everyday occurrence in many high schools in Los Angeles anyway. But Bob became deeply concerned about the safety of the children, and without consulting anybody, went on television and urged all the parents to keep the students home for their safety. On Thursday of the first week of the strike, we suddenly had professional class sizes in Los Angeles for the first time in history. We had half the teachers and half the students. And suddenly the management looked out and said they had a controllable situation. In fact, it was the best situation they've ever had. And they said, we'll ride this sucker out until they die on the vine. And what should have been a 3-day strike turned into a month and 3-day strike because of that very humanistic, compassionate, but foolish political act, strategic act on the part of the president of the organization. We now know that on Thursday, the high school principals had formed a caucus and were going to force the superintendent to close the schools. If they had closed the schools, we had been at the bargaining table, open the schools, they had gotten their contract and it had been over with. As the strike drug on, and by the way, it was a serialistic strike because it was a first merged strike and the strike by a merger, and what you had was that everything that was done, there was an NEA lawyer and an AFT lawyer, and if there was an AFT staff person, there was an NEA staff person. So and a local staff person. So everything had two shadows behind it. So it was really an awkward operation to run. But as the strike drug on, disenchantment sets in, as they always do in long strikes of that nature. And when it was finally settled, they won the contract. They got the salary they demanded. They got a binding contract with binding arbitration grievances. Everything the law said you can't have. They wanted. So it was a winning strike. However, within a month afterwards, the court had set aside the entire agreement, saying you can't have a contract, you can't have binding arbitration, and they took everything away from them that they wanted in the strike, everything, but the 6% pay raise. So you had really a disenchanted group of teachers, really angry. They had lost everything. What they were left with was this thing called the merged organization, and it spawned a new organization called PEG. Professional Educators of it's called PALA in Los Angeles, Professional Educators of Los Angeles. Nationally, it's called the Professional Educators Group Incorporated, PEG. And it's a group of right-wing teachers who are against collective bargaining and, really hardline right-wing ideological political group. It's called NAEP nationally, National Association of Professional Educators. That's what it's called now. So they had a merger, and with even greater irony, it is the only merged organization that has survived to this day in the United States, and it's like this as UTLA.